Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Looking forward to talking to you today about candidates. Candidates, obviously, being a very important sort of subject in the study of political behavior, and really, I think, in sort of the historical view, a somewhat overlooked topic in the scientific literature on voting. And I think that's partially revealed in a contrast, perhaps, between this week's reading and last week's reading. So, of course, if you look at last week, we can take this extreme long view of voting behavior and think about how, essentially candidate support and party support is really shaped by the way that groups and parties interact over time, and this kind of incredible dance of the party system as it breaks down and reformulates. And, we have periods of kind of one party control at the national level, and then two parties, and then in very rare cases, multi party contested elections. Of course, 1860 being an important one. At the end of the day, right, this is kind of a view of elections that really finds itself at the back of the funnel of causality, right? This is kind of a socio-historical explanation, and certainly the one that really I think has the most currency is Carmine and Simpson's issue evolution. And so again, something to really take a close look at. Issue evolution makes the case that, sort of in a Darwinian fashion, parties kind of rise and fall, and are split apart and reformulate on the basis of these kind of cross-cutting cleavage issues that emerge and force parties to have to adapt to survive. And so when issue evolutions occur, we see real shakeups in terms of voters' alignments and attachments with the party system. But at the end of the day, right, we also have to think about the fact that these kind of broad, kind of grinding gears, where these two or multiple parties are shifting in terms of their allegiance to specific issues, and voters are sort of slowly filtering and falling out in terms of their allegiances, can be sort of a punctuated equilibrium that is most often punctuated by the appearance of really persuasive and path-breaking leaders or elites. And so, for example, I think about the Republican Party of 1860 and the idea that Abraham Lincoln was this kind of especially, larger than life kind of figure, even physically, like literally, right? A person who changed the entire game politically by crafting this new appeal that would ultimately be that wedge issue that exploded the existing party system. We can go back to Jacksonian democracy, for example, and the end of the era of good feelings as being this pivotal moment where this big candidate, right, was able to really reshape the way that parties are contested. And then again, like I think also about kind of the current world that we're in, and the idea that 2016 was a particular election in which we had maybe the rise of this new or at least redefined kind of populism that I think now a lot of people are calling Trumpism. And so, obviously these are three very different figures, certainly, but just examples, perhaps, of the kinds of path-breaking individuals that can also contribute to massive changes to the way that voters at the margins see elections. And so, again, political personalities could matter a lot, right? Candidates could matter a lot because they are going to signal new issue agendas, and they're going to signal new approaches and priorities to constituencies. And so, candidate personalities matter, but I think we also need to think about candidates at the grassroots level as well. There might be big sort of pivotal sort of leaders that are changing the party system, but in more normal times, politics in normal times, we often have to ask the question of whether or not candidates at that lower level are also constituting new issue platforms or not, or whether they are redefining the parties through simply their act of running for office. And so, another question, a corollary question we have to think about is this question of candidate recruitment and emergence. And certainly in the reading this week, and this is really just me pointing to that reading, is to really think about this idea that at the local levels, candidate recruitment happens as a result of systematic party organizations saying, hey, we want this person, to come and run, and we're going to try to provide them with some incentives. And, if we think about Congress, like virtually everyone who's in Congress now began their journey as a political candidate at a lower level. And so these lower level elections are things to watch for those of us who are interested in voting behavior, because again, who actually is on the ballot matters a lot in terms of the way that voters perceive the parties and the way that we see the parties changing in the future in terms of their strategies to attract new coalitions of voters. So, these party organizations have a really important role. And I think that at least one piece of this, and in this I want to point you a little bit to the Brookman et al. Reading for this week, is to think about the median voter theorem that we may have discussed, way back at the very beginning of class. This idea that, from the 1950s era, that when two parties compete, eventually they're going to start competing for that person who's in the middle of the ideological spectrum, because they know they're, if you're a left party that's competing, you're going to get everybody that's more left than you. And if you're the right party, you're going to get everybody that's more right than you. So you might as well position yourself right in the middle, because what you essentially want to do is get all the people that are to the right from you plus one if you're on the right, or everybody to the left of you plus one if you're on the left, and you'll win the election. And so essentially the median voter theorem tells us the consequences that voters will vote on the basis of the ideological appeals of the two parties, and that parties, in order to attract that voter, are going to moderate. They're going to become more and more and more moderate. But if we look at candidate recruitment and the emergence of candidates today in a lot of these elections, we're not really seeing that. We're not seeing such moderate candidates out there. We're actually seeing more and more and more fairly ideologically extreme candidates. And so if we want to answer the question, how do parties choose these candidates as they are seeking to enter the political arena, is it the case that local party organizations are preferring ideologically non-median candidates or not? Right? What's the mechanism, and how is it that we end up with a lot of these extreme candidates out there? Right? How is it that Congress is now becoming a much more polarized place in terms of the kinds of ideological decisions of these elites? So again, this is just kind of me pointing you to this reading, right? I think it's very important to think about one aspect of candidates today is their ideology, and if they are violating this kind of perspective, then we need to know why. But beyond ideology, we also know that candidates come to the election with a variety of different demographic sort of traits that they are either sort of campaigning on, using those kinds of identities as a way to, flesh out their platform, or not. And so I think that the congressional demographics, at least going up until the 115th Congress, in some of these figures, really, I think, show a few kind of remarkable trends. One being that Congress is becoming somewhat more diverse by race and ethnicity, though not tremendously. And certainly, one thing that we can remark from these demographic sort of breakdowns is that Congress, it does not resemble yet, although this trend is increasing, does not resemble the sort of actual demographic composition of the American public, or even the voting public. Right? We're not really seeing the share of members of Congress who fall into some of these racial and ethnic categories sort of matching the volume of these individuals in the population. And so that's one thing to think about. There's an imbalance, essentially a demographic imbalance between Congress as it's constituted today and America today. One other kind of major imbalance that we've seen historically has been the number of women in Congress. And certainly since the 1990s, we started to see this number rise. We're seeing a precipitous increase in the number of women in Congress. But again, still, because of course the density of women and men in the population is about 50-50, we still have a very long way to go in terms of actually achieving gender parity in Congress. And so the sort of glass ceiling effect still seems to hold quite strongly, despite the fact that it is diminishing to some extent. If we go further, we can think about also the idea that back in the day, right, in the 60s, almost everybody in Congress actually had served in the military, which is an interesting kind of, not demographic, kind of occupational descriptor, and something that has, really, really declined over time to the extent that now, only about a fifth of members of Congress have any military service whatsoever. So this actually is quite an interesting trend, and perhaps tells us something not about religious breakdown, which, as we can see, essentially Protestants have declined somewhat in Congress relative to other religious affiliations. Catholics have essentially gained. But really, I want to get into this one, right? The idea that congressional demographics by occupation really speak to the existence of about four kind of major categories for occupational descriptors, that being public office, business, law, or education in the House and Senate. And we'll say, for those of you who are taking a close look at this figure, that these numbers do not sum to, the Senate does not sum to 100, and this obviously does not sum to 435. That's because many of these individuals have multiple descriptors. Somebody could be, for example, business and public office or law and public office. So really, what this shows you, though, is that there's really just a couple of tracks in terms of occupation. And largely, these are occupational tracks, especially between business and law, where they're highly lucrative. We've seen, medicine starting to increase to some extent in recent times, but still, really the plurality of members of Congress, not the outright majority, are basically either businessmen and women or lawyers. And so, based on the fact that these are generally sort of combined, right? These are business people and lawyers who have held public office before entering Congress. This is really the description of a member of Congress. And so I think this is a very important question to also take into consideration. Beyond the demographic breakdowns, what about this occupational breakdown as well? Certainly we know that members of Congress are super old. They're much older than the average sort of member of the population, but especially in the Senate, where we've got this kind of tale of the very elderly who are participating in Congress. But the basic question that I think we need to consider is whether or not we think these patterns matter for who gets what, for the actual laws that are created. Because if we believe that this descriptive representational sort of imbalance doesn't produce any negative consequences for our democracy or for the groups that are being underrepresented in Congress, then this is not a big deal. Right? But if we do believe that these kinds of things matter, and maybe that has to do with age, maybe that has to do with occupation, certainly, maybe some of these other sort of considerations, then we've got a serious problem on our hands. And we need to think about why it is that these imbalances continue to occur. Right? Why are there fewer women? Why is the average member of Congress a millionaire? Right? A millionaire, business person, or a lawyer, basically. Those are your two options. And of course, why are members of Congress so old? And so certainly, I think we need to remember that in today's politics, candidate resources are going to matter a tremendous amount. Right? Our ideological platforms are going to matter as well, as we've seen in this Brookman et al. Reading. And also self-efficacy. Right? We also have, to some extent, the belief that people who run for office need to believe that they can win. And actually, we have some evidence that, underrepresented groups in Congress are actually more often discouraging themselves from running than are the more overrepresented sort of factions in Congress. And this self-efficacy connection, we need to really think carefully about. We'll see this, for example, in the Fox and Lawless reading, which is all about this question of running from office and why younger people today are much less excited about potentially getting involved in a career in public service. But again, we also need to think carefully about how the public evaluates these candidates, because essentially this is the question. If there's some kind of ceiling, which is preventing candidates with certain demographic profiles from winning office, then either it's sort of people have low self-efficacy and they're preventing themselves from entering into the race, or parties are preventing these people from coming into the race, or the public is essentially preventing people from coming into Congress by not voting for them. And so in terms of this third hypothesis, this idea that the public simply doesn't like some of the groups that are being underrepresented in Congress, this is an empirical question, and one that we can get into, I think, with some nifty political science research methods. And so, for example, we could do experiments. And I know many of the studies that we're looking at in this week and over the course of the semester have used survey experiments. And so survey experiments are a really powerful way to evaluate the degree to which there are latent prejudices in the public in terms of their unwillingness to support candidates with certain descriptors. Now, these are not perfect studies. Certainly, they are very artificial in terms of not preventing, but rather presenting individuals with, just sort of artificial candidates and giving them a very low stakes choice between two candidates that don't exist. But they still nevertheless can give us some initial glimpses of ideas about whether the public finds certain characteristics to be more or less attractive in terms of what makes for a candidate. And so, for example, and I apologize that this slide compiled wrong and there's sort of an issue here. What we can do is we can give individuals in a survey setting essentially a comparison between two candidates. Let's call this person Townsend and this person Jim McSwain in a variety of different experimental treatment groups, much the same way that somebody who's in an experimental drug trial might get either a placebo or an experimental drug. In one case, we could have Jim McSwain run against this person, let's call them Bob Townsend, and Bob Townsend is a male in this. So essentially these brackets get replaced by just the word he. we can compare that to a control group or another experimental group where instead of Bob Townsend, now it's Bobby Townsend, and these are replaced with she's. And so essentially, there's a random subsample of individuals who get Jim versus Bob, and there's a random subset of individuals who get to see Jim versus Bobby. And at the end of the experiment, both groups are asked to evaluate which of the two candidates they would vote for. Now, if you think about it, right, if you read these candidate vignettes, we'll see that, in large part, Republicans are going to support Jim McSwain no matter what, and Democrats are going to support Bob or Bobby Townsend no matter what, because of the fact that one is a conservative Republican and one is a liberal Democrat. But at the end of the day, if this slight change to the vignette has an effect on whether or not individuals will be more likely to support Bobby versus Jim, we should see that the vote totals, essentially, or the support totals across these two conditions are going to vary slightly. And that means that a few people who are in the middle here are going to be peeled off in one direction or the other, resulting in a slight deflection. And the size of that deflection is something that could tell us about whether or not we think that there is some degree, essentially, of prejudice in the electorate where people are excited about the female candidate or more excited about the male candidate. And so in modern experiments, we can do this a variety of ways. This is a very, very simple example, but we can do a number of different kinds of treatments like this, one of which is called a conjoint experiment, which manipulates a wide variety of different details and maybe runs Jim against a variety of candidates. And so people make a number of different choices. And of course, these kinds of experimental manipulations are all sort of embedded in there. So more and more complex kinds of experiments can be run that helps to distill the role of gender, the role of other characteristics. So again, here we can see, in this case, we could do something similar where this Bob is always Bob and not Bobby. But instead, we're manipulating some sort of descriptors of a kind of candidate's background, right? So in this case, Bob is either a graduate of Princeton or of a community college, and is either somebody who's in a very prestigious profession or somebody who's in a profession that maybe doesn't have as much of like a prestige connotation. And so maybe in this experiment, we could compare Bob in one condition versus Bob in another condition and see if people tend to be motivated to support Bob on the basis of sort of more prestigious or less prestigious characteristics. And so from these kinds of experiments, there's a variety of different findings that have emerged over time. I don't buy all of these. I think that many of these are kind of one-off experiments. We need to do a lot more work to continue to verify and to replicate these findings. But in general, we tend to see some things that have some level of support. For example, candidates that are tall and physically large tend to have some marginal effect of increased support in these kinds of, especially when there's a visual, right? They use like stock photos to represent the candidates. Physically attractive, essentially attractiveness or perceived attractiveness tends to matter in these kinds of candidate popularity contests. If you're a white-collar professional, that's another thing. We've seen that in these kinds of experiments that professional occupation matters to some extent. And then also, if you're older, that's also something that tends to get voters a little more excited about you. And so these are kind of marginal effects, kind of small effects that are nevertheless, I think, things to think about when comparing candidates. But of course, there's a lot more effects that we've tested. Many of them are murky, many of them are sort of contradictory, or they're very contingent upon ideology, party, and local context. And so again, really, we still are left with some degree of a conundrum here because we don't really know much about, we haven't been able to fully articulate the answer to the question of whether barriers to entry in Congress and in other elected bodies is really the result of voters or party organizations or the candidates themselves being reticent to run. And again, some of these dynamics, some of the answer to this question is really going to be dependent upon the candidate, right? Sometimes these are not answers that can be very easily kind of aggregated up to a high level. But one thing to really think about is this idea that if we go back to the Carnes reading, class doesn't seem to have a tremendous amount of an effect here, especially when looking at voter support for candidates with upper or lower class kinds of descriptors. And so this is actually a really important finding, specifically because what we see in today's politics is that essentially blue-collar candidates or candidates with these kind of blue-collar descriptions tend to be essentially an extinct an extinct animal, right? We're seeing fewer and fewer and fewer people from blue collar sort of backgrounds winning seats in Congress. And so again, if we think carefully, we think closely about this question of whether it's the voters or whether it's party organizations or whether it's the candidates themselves that are essentially being the bottleneck in terms of getting certain kinds of candidates to Congress. This blue collar finding really speaks to the idea that, first of all, running for office is now becoming incredibly expensive, and sort of self-funded campaigns are on the rise, meaning that blue collar candidates without much financial resource base before running are going to have a harder time. But also the fact that parties themselves might be cognizant of that fact and eschew certain candidates that are running without those kinds of backgrounds and without that money that comes from the beginning of the race. So again, these are really important things to think about. I really want to zoom in and highlight this idea that our politics, in addition to kind of the slow positive story of Congress becoming more diverse, is nevertheless becoming less diverse in one of the more important sort of demographic factors, which is class, right? Essentially, or sort of occupation or income status. And so the idea that Congress is becoming increasingly rich is something that we could really think about and talk about as being a potentially negative consequence for representation. And so with that, I leave you to think about these ideas. Really take a close look at the reading for this week, and I look forward to hopefully having a robust discussion about this and many other topics in our class on Wednesday. Have a wonderful week, everyone. I'll see you then.